My name is Victoria Hayes, and at 26 years old, I'm about to destroy the two people who gave me life but tried to take everything else away. For 18 years, I lived in what appeared to be the perfect suburban home in Greenwich, Connecticut, where my father, Dr. Robert Hayes, was a respected orthopedic surgeon, and my mother, Linda Hayes, was the president of the Junior League. Behind our pristine colonial facade with its award-winning garden, however, my parents were architects of cruelty who treated my childhood like a sick experiment in psychological warfare. They never left marks where anyone could see them. My father's medical training made him an expert at inflicting maximum pain with minimal visible evidence. The bruises were always hidden beneath clothing. The injuries always explained away with carefully rehearsed stories about my clumsiness and attention-seeking behavior. When I was 8 years old, my mother held my face under bathwater until I nearly drowned, then calmly dried my hair and told me that if I ever mentioned it to anyone, she would make sure I never saw sunlight again. The worst part wasn't the physical torture. It was watching them perform as loving parents in public while knowing that behind closed doors, I was nothing more than a target for their inexplicable rage. That night, as I lay in my bed struggling to breathe normally, I made a promise to myself that I would survive long enough to make them pay for every moment of terror they had inflicted. The pattern of abuse was so methodical that I didn't realize other families lived differently until I was almost 10 years old. Every infraction, real or imagined, carried consequences that were designed to break my spirit systematically. When I brought home a report card with a single B+ among straight A's, my father locked me in our basement for 3 days with only water, telling my school that I had come down with the flu. The basement was where they kept their most creative punishments. A soundproofed room beneath our house, where my screams couldn't reach the neighbors who thought so highly of the Hayes family. My mother would sit at the top of the stairs reading magazines while my father corrected my attitude with techniques that would have made professional interrogators proud. They never called it abuse. They called it character building and teaching important life lessons. During neighborhood barbecues and school events, they would regale other parents with stories about my behavioral challenges and how much effort they put into helping me overcome my difficulties. Other adults would look at me with pity and praise my parents for their patience and dedication to such a troubled child. I learned to smile and nod when people complimented my parents' parenting, all while hiding fresh wounds beneath carefully chosen clothing. The isolation was perhaps more damaging than the physical abuse because it meant that even when I was surrounded by people, I was completely alone with my truth. School became my temporary sanctuary, but even there, my parents' influence cast a shadow over every interaction. They had cultivated relationships with teachers and administrators, positioning themselves as concerned parents dealing with a difficult child who required special attention. When I was 12, I finally worked up the courage to show my English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, the cigarette burns on my arms that my mother had inflicted as punishment for forgetting to clean my room. Mrs. Patterson listened with apparent concern and promised to help. But within 2 hours, my parents had been contacted by the school administration. That evening, my father explained calmly that this was exactly the kind of a manipulative behavior that concerned them, and they had decided I needed intensive therapy to address my tendency towards self-harm and fabrication. The next week, I was enrolled in Riverside Academy, a therapeutic boarding school, 4 hours away that specialized in troubled adolescents with behavioral disorders. My parents told everyone they were heartbroken to send me away, but felt it was necessary for my mental health and recovery. The school was another form of prison, where the staff had been briefed about my psychological issues and treated every word I spoke with suspicion. I spent 3 years there, counting down the days until I could escape to college and begin building the evidence that would eventually bring my parents to justice. The financial control they exercised was another weapon in their arsenal, designed to keep me dependent and compliant even as I grew older. Throughout high school and college, they held my future hostage by threatening to withdraw funding for my education if I didn't maintain their version of events about our loving family dynamic. They made me sign legal documents promising to uphold the family's reputation and threatening devastating consequences if I ever spoke publicly about our private family matters. These contracts, which I later learned were legally meaningless, terrified my 18-year-old self and kept me silent through 4 years at Yale. Even when I received partial scholarships that should have reduced my dependence on them, they found ways to maintain control by claiming me as a dependent for tax purposes and threatening to report me for fraud if I tried to establish financial independence. During my college years, they would send care packages filled with expensive items I had never requested, always accompanied by handwritten notes about how much they missed their daughter and hoped I wasn't getting the help I needed to overcome my challenges. These packages felt like psychological terrorism, reminding me that no matter how far I ran or how successful I became, they were still watching, still controlling the narrative about who I was and what I represented to the world. The message was clear. I belonged to them, and they would never let me forget it. What I discovered during my sophomore year at Yale changed everything and gave me the first real hope I had felt since childhood. While researching a paper on family law, I stumbled across a legal precedent that made my heart race. Adult children could file criminal charges against their parents for childhood abuse, even years after the fact, if there was sufficient evidence and the crimes fell within the extended statute of limitations. That night, I locked myself in my dorm room and began making a list of every injury, every incident, every witness who might be able to corroborate my story. For the first time in my life, I had something my parents couldn't take away from me: the knowledge that justice was possible, and I was going to be the one to deliver it. I started keeping detailed journals, not just about my memories of abuse, but about my parents, current behavior, their friends, their professional associations, and anything else that might be relevant to building a case against them. I also began the delicate process of requesting my medical records from the various hospitals where I had been treated over the years, using my legal right as an adult to access my own healthcare information. What I found in those records was even more damning than I had hoped. 8 separate emergency room visits between the ages of 6 and 16, with injuries that any competent physician should have recognized as inconsistent with the explanations provided. The pattern was undeniable, and for the first time in my life, I had proof that my memories were real and that what had happened to me mattered. My parents had made one crucial mistake in their years of abuse. They had left a paper trail, and I was going to use it to destroy them. The memories I had suppressed for years began flooding back with terrifying clarity once I committed to pursuing justice. And what emerged was a pattern of calculated cruelty that went far beyond random acts of violence. My parents weren't just abusive. They were methodical predators who had turned child-rearing into a twisted science experiment designed to create the perfect victim. They kept detailed notebooks about my behavioral modifications, tracking which punishments were most effective at achieving complete compliance and which methods left the least visible evidence. I discovered these notebooks years later, hidden in my father's home office. And reading them was like finding the blueprint for my own destruction written in cold and clinical language that reduced my childhood trauma to data points and statistical outcomes. They had documented everything: how long I could be deprived of food before showing signs of malnutrition, which types of physical abuse produced the most psychological impact, and how to manipulate medical professionals into accepting their explanations for my injuries. The notebook contained photos of my injuries taken for their own reference, alongside notes about successful interventions and areas for improvement in their technique. Discovering this evidence was simultaneously validating and horrifying because it proved that every moment of my suffering had been planned, executed, and refined like a horrific research project. The psychological warfare they waged was even more sophisticated than the physical abuse, designed to convince me that I was worthless, crazy, and deserving of everything they did to me. They would gaslight me constantly, denying events that had just occurred and convincing me that my memory was fundamentally unreliable. When I was 13, my mother pushed me down a full flight of stairs, causing a concussion that left me unconscious for several minutes. But when I woke up in the hospital, she had convinced the medical staff that I had been experimenting with drugs and had fallen during a psychotic episode. The doctor prescribed psychiatric medication and recommended immediate mental health intervention, never questioning why a straight-A student with no prior behavioral issues would suddenly develop a drug problem. My parents used this incident to have me committed to a psychiatric facility for 2 weeks, where I was heavily medicated and subjected to therapy designed to help me accept responsibility for my self-destructive behaviors. The psychiatrist, Dr. Morrison, was completely convinced by my parents' on performance and spent our sessions trying to get me to admit that I had a substance abuse problem and suicidal tendencies. When I insisted that my mother had pushed me, he increased my medication and extended my stay, explaining to my parents that I was showing signs of delusional thinking and aggressive resistance to treatment. Those 2 weeks taught me that the system designed to protect children could be easily manipulated by parents who understood how to speak the language of mental health professionals. The financial resources they used to cover their tracks were staggering, and I began to understand how they had managed to avoid detection for so many years. My father's position as chief of orthopedics at Greenwich Hospital gave him access to medical professionals who trusted his judgment implicitly, and he used those relationships to ensure that my injuries were always treated by doctors who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. When I ended up in emergency rooms, it was never at the hospital where he worked. They had a carefully planned system of rotating between facilities in different counties to avoid creating a pattern that might trigger mandatory reporting protocols. My mother's extensive volunteer work with children's charities provided her with perfect cover, as no one could imagine that a woman who devoted so much time to helping vulnerable children could be systematically abusing her own daughter. She served on the board of directors for 3 different child advocacy organizations and was frequently quoted in local newspapers about the importance of protecting children from abuse and neglect. The cruel irony of watching her give speeches about child welfare while knowing what she did to me at home was almost unbearable. But it also taught me how predators hide in plain sight by positioning themselves as protectors. They donated significant amounts of money to children's hospitals, abuse prevention programs, and family counseling services, buying themselves a reputation for compassion that served as armor against any potential accusations. What made their abuse even more insidious was how they turned other family members and friends into unwitting accomplices by convincing everyone that I was mentally unstable and prone to fabricating stories for attention. They systematically poisoned my relationships with extended family by sharing carefully edited versions of incidents that made me look disturbed, and them look like suffering saints. My grandmother, who had been my closest ally during early childhood, began treating me with fearful concern after my parents convinced her that I had been diagnosed with severe personality disorders and delusional tendencies. During family gatherings, I could feel the weight of their collective pity and suspicion as relatives who once loved me unconditionally now saw me as a cautionary tale about mental illness and family dysfunction. My parents had weaponized mental health stigma to isolate me completely, ensuring that even if I found the courage to speak up, no one would believe me over their carefully crafted reputation. They created a narrative so compelling that even I sometimes wondered if they were right, if my memories of abuse were just manifestations of some deeper psychological disorder that I couldn't recognize or control. This level of manipulation was perhaps their most devastating weapon, because it didn't just hurt my body. It made me question my own sanity and my right to seek help or justice. The turning point came when I discovered that I wasn't their only victim, a revelation that transformed my personal quest for justice into something much larger and more urgent. During my junior year at Yale, I was contacted by a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had been my parents' foster child for 6 months when I was 14. She had tracked me down through social media after reading about my academic achievements in our town's newspaper, and she wanted to share something that had been haunting her for years. Over coffee in New Haven, Sarah told me about the special punishments my parents had inflicted on her during her brief stay in our home, punishments that matched my own experiences with terrifying precision. She had tried to report the abuse to her caseworker, but my parents had convinced the authorities that she was a troubled teenager, acting out against loving foster parents who were trying to help her heal from previous trauma. Her reports were dismissed as adjustment difficulties, and she was moved to another placement without any investigation into her allegations. Sarah had carried the guilt of not being believed for over a decade, convinced that she had somehow failed to protect any future children who might be placed in my parents' care. Learning that there had been other victims filled me with a rage I had never experienced before. But it also gave me something even more powerful: corroborating evidence and a witness whose story could support my own testimony. That night, I called Sarah and asked if she would be willing to join me in pursuing criminal charges against Robert and Linda Hayes. Her answer was immediate and fierce. I've been waiting 12 years for someone to ask me that question. Law school at Columbia became my war room, where every assignment felt like training for the battle I knew was coming. While my classmates complained about the workload, I devoured every course on criminal procedure, evidence law, and trial advocacy with the intensity of someone preparing for the fight of her life. Professor Sandra Martinez's seminar on prosecuting complex abuse cases became my masterclass, and I stayed after every session asking detailed questions about witness preparation, evidence preservation, and jury psychology. She probably thought I was an exceptionally dedicated student, but I was actually learning the skills I would need to take down two of the most manipulative people I had ever known. My internship at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office gave me unprecedented access to real prosecutors working similar cases, and I volunteered for every assignment involving family violence or child abuse, absorbing everything I could about how successful cases were built and presented. The prosecutor I worked with most closely, James Rodriguez, was legendary for his ability to convict defendants who seemed untouchable, and watching him prepare cases taught me that meticulous documentation and unshakable witness preparation were the keys to victory in court. Every night, I went home and applied what I had learned to my own case, building a prosecution strategy that would be impossible for any defense attorney to dismantle. The evidence I had been collecting for years finally began to coalesce into something that looked like justice when I partnered with Sarah Mitchell to build our case together. Having a corroborating witness changed everything, because it meant their defense couldn't rely solely on portraying me as a delusional daughter seeking revenge against loving parents. Sarah's memories of abuse matched mine with disturbing precision, and together we created a timeline that showed a consistent pattern of behavior spanning multiple victims over many years. We spent countless hours on encrypted phone calls, sharing details that we had never told another living soul, and the validation of having someone who truly understood what we had endured was almost as powerful as the legal case we were building. Sarah had kept meticulous records of her own experiences, including dates, times, and specific details about the methods my parents used to inflict maximum psychological damage. She had also maintained contact with her former caseworker, who admitted privately that she had always harbored suspicions about my parents, but had been unable to act on them without concrete evidence. The caseworker, Maria Santos, agreed to testify about the institutional failures that had allowed my parents to continue fostering children despite red flags that should have triggered immediate investigation. Having a social services professional willing to admit systemic failures added credibility to our case that no defense attorney could easily dismiss. The breakthrough that transformed our case from strong to unassailable came when I discovered the notebooks my parents had kept documenting their experimental methods for controlling my behavior. During winter break of my final year in law school, I broke into my childhood home using a key I had hidden years earlier, knowing that my parents were attending a medical conference in Switzerland. What I found in my father's locked office was beyond anything I had imagined in my worst nightmares. 3 leather-bound journals containing detailed documentation of every punishment they had inflicted, complete with photographs, effectiveness ratings, and notes about improvements for future use. The entries were written in clinical language that reduced my suffering to data points, with headings like subject response to food deprivation and optimal duration for isolation therapy. One entry described the night my father had tried to strangle me as a successful intervention that produced immediate compliance and reduced resistance to authority by 85%. Reading about my own torture described like a science experiment nearly broke me, but it also gave me evidence so damning that no jury would be able to ignore it. I photographed every page with a high-resolution camera, then returned the notebooks to their exact positions and left the house without disturbing anything else. That evidence would become the cornerstone of our prosecution, proof that my parents' abuse was not the result of anger or loss of control, but calculated cruelty designed to destroy their victims systematically. The most challenging aspect of building our case was preparing for the psychological warfare that my parents would unleash once they realized we were serious about prosecuting them. I had learned enough about their methods to know that they would try to destroy our credibility by portraying us as mentally unstable conspirators seeking attention and money through false accusations. To counter this strategy, I arranged for comprehensive psychological evaluations from independent experts who specialized in trauma and abuse survivors. Dr. Angela Thompson, a forensic psychologist with extensive experience in criminal cases, conducted detailed assessments of both Sarah and me over several months, documenting the specific types of trauma responses that were consistent with our allegations. Her final report concluded that our psychological profiles were entirely consistent with survivors of systematic childhood abuse, and that our accounts showed remarkable consistency and credibility. We also underwent polygraph examinations administered by a former FBI examiner, both of us passing with no signs of deception when describing the abuse we had suffered. These expert opinions would be crucial in establishing our credibility and countering any attempts to portray us as unreliable witnesses motivated by revenge or financial gain. I knew that my parents would spare no expense in hiring their own experts to contradict our evidence, but I was confident that the truth would withstand any scrutiny they could bring to bear. The decision to file criminal charges came after I graduated from law school and passed the New York bar exam, finally having both the knowledge and the credentials to see the case through to its conclusion. Sarah and I met with District Attorney Helen Chang personally, presenting her with over 200 pages of evidence that we had compiled over 2 years of intensive investigation. The evidence included medical records from 8 different hospitals, expert psychological evaluations, witness statements from former neighbors and teachers, and most damning of all, the photographs of my parents, detailed abuse journals. DeChung reviewed our materials for 3 hours, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly sitting in stunned silence as the scope of my parents' crimes became clear. When she finally spoke, her words sent electricity through my entire body. This is one of the most comprehensive and compelling cases of systematic child abuse I have seen in 20 years of prosecution. We're going to file charges, and we're going to make sure they never hurt another child. That afternoon, she assigned her most experienced prosecutor, Michael Torres, to lead the case, and within a week, arrest warrants had been issued for Robert and Linda Hayes on charges of aggravated child abuse, endangerment, assault, and conspiracy to commit child abuse. As I signed the formal complaint that would trigger their arrest, my hands were steady for the first time in years, and my voice was clear when I said the words that would change everything. I want them to face the full consequences of what they did to us. The war was about to begin, but for the first time in my life, I was fighting back with weapons they couldn't take away from me. The morning my parents were arrested was a crisp Tuesday in October, and I watched from across the street as police officers walked up to their pristine colonial home at exactly 6:30 a.m. Through the telephoto lens of my camera, I could see my father's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and then pure fury as Detective Morrison explained why they were there. My mother appeared behind him in her silk robe, and for one perfect moment, she looked directly across the street to where I sat in my rental car, our eyes meeting for the first time in 3 years. Even from that distance, I could see the moment when she realized that her broken daughter had finally found a way to fight back. The image of my respectable parents being led away in handcuffs, while their neighbors emerged from their mansions to watch, was worth every sleepless night I had spent building this case. Within hours, my phone was ringing non-stop with calls from reporters, relatives, and former family friends who couldn't believe that the perfect Hayes family was making headlines for all the wrong reasons. The story broke first on local news. Prominent Greenwich surgeon and wife charged with systematic child abuse. But by evening, it had been picked up by national media and was trending on social media. The comment section became a battlefield between people expressing shock and others sharing their own stories of suspected abuse in families that looked perfect from the outside. Reading those responses, I realized that our case had become larger than just my personal quest for justice. It was opening a conversation about how predators hide behind social status and professional respectability. Their bail hearing 3 days later revealed the full scope of the defense strategy that I had been anticipating and preparing for since law school. Their attorney, Marcus Whitfield, was exactly what I had expected: an expensive, smooth-talking specialist in defending wealthy clients who found themselves in unfortunate situations. He immediately began painting Sarah and me as unstable conspirators who had fabricated our allegations for financial gain and media attention. According to Whitfield's narrative, I was a troubled young woman who had struggled with mental health issues throughout my childhood and was now seeking to blame my loving parents for problems that stemmed from my own psychological disorders. He presented psychiatric records from my teenage years as proof that I had a history of delusional thinking and attention-seeking behavior, conveniently omitting the context of why I had needed psychiatric treatment in the first place. Sarah was portrayed as a former foster child with a documented history of making false allegations against authority figures, who had been manipulated by me into supporting my revenge fantasy against the people who had tried to help her. The judge granted bail with the condition that my parents surrender their passports and have no contact with Sarah or me. But watching them walk out of that courtroom in expensive suits, flanked by their high-powered legal team, reminded me that this battle was far from over. They had resources, connections, and decades of experience in manipulating systems designed to protect children. But I had something they had never expected me to develop: the knowledge and determination to beat them at their own game. The media circus that followed their release from jail was both a blessing and a curse that tested every coping mechanism I had developed over the years. My parents hired a public relations firm to manage their image, and suddenly, stories began appearing in local and national media about their charitable work, their contributions to the community, and the heartbreak they felt over their daughter's false accusations. Former colleagues wrote letters to the editor, defending their character, and the children's hospital where my mother had volunteered issued a statement expressing complete confidence in her integrity and dedication to child welfare. They even convinced my grandmother to give a tearful interview to the Greenwich Times, where she described how worried the family was about my deteriorating mental health, and how they all hoped I would get the help I needed to overcome these delusions. Watching my own grandmother repeat their lies on camera was one of the most painful moments of the entire process. But it also strengthened my resolve, because I realized how many people they had manipulated over the years to maintain their facade. The prosecutor, Michael Torres, warned me that this was standard operating procedure in high-profile abuse cases, and that I needed to stay focused on the evidence rather than getting drawn into the public relations battle that my parents were fighting in the media. He was right, but the emotional toll of watching them successfully manipulate public opinion was devastating. And there were nights when I wondered if pursuing justice had been worth the price I was paying in terms of my own mental health and family relationships. The preliminary hearing in December revealed the true strength of our case when Torres presented the evidence that Sarah and I had spent years collecting. The photographs of my parents, abuse journals, caused an audible gasp in the courtroom. And I watched the color drain from my father's face as the prosecutor read excerpts describing their unexperimental methods for breaking my spirit. Judge Patricia Williams, a no-nonsense veteran of family court, seemed genuinely horrified as she reviewed the medical records documenting my multiple emergency room visits and the expert testimony explaining how the pattern of injuries was consistent with systematic abuse rather than accidents. The most powerful moment came when Sarah took the stand to describe her own experiences as a foster child in my parents' home, her voice steady and clear as she recounted punishments that matched my own experiences with terrifying precision. Marcus Whitfield tried to discredit her testimony by bringing up her troubled background and previous foster placements. But Sarah was prepared for his attacks and answered every question with calm dignity that made his aggressive tactics look desperate and cruel. When the judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, my parents' confident facade finally cracked, and I saw genuine fear in their eyes for the first time in my life. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt like I had finally leveled the playing field between us, and the scared little girl who had learned to hide her bruises was beginning to transform into the woman who would expose their crimes to the world. As the trial date approached, my parents made one final attempt to avoid accountability by offering to settle the case out of court with a public apology and a substantial financial payment in exchange for Sarah and me dropping all criminal charges. Their lawyer framed the offer as an opportunity for healing and reconciliation that would allow everyone to move forward without the trauma of a public trial. The proposed settlement was genuinely substantial, enough money to pay off our student loans and set us up financially for years to come, and they knew that accepting it would be the practical choice for two young women just starting their careers. But money had never been the point of this journey, and taking their settlement would have meant letting them escape justice while potentially allowing them to harm other children in the future. When I thought about the notebooks documenting their abuse techniques, the photographs they had taken of my injuries for their own reference, and the clinical language they had used to describe my suffering, I knew that no amount of money could buy them redemption for what they had done. The night before we had to respond to their offer, Sarah and I sat in my apartment in Manhattan, weighing the decision that would define the rest of our lives. "They want to pay us to stay silent one more time," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet fury. "But we're not those scared children anymore, and they don't get to buy their way out of what they did to us." The next morning, we called Michael Torres and told him to reject the settlement offer unconditionally. We were going to trial, and this time, the whole world would hear our story. The morning of my testimony, I stood in the courthouse bathroom looking at the woman in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back at me. Gone was the terrified child who had learned to flinch at raised voices, replaced by someone who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. I wore a navy blue suit that Michael Torres had helped me select. Professional but approachable, credible but not intimidating. My hands were steady as I applied concealer over the small scar on my temple, a permanent reminder of the night my father had thrown a medical textbook at my head when I was 15. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and strangers who had followed our case through months of media coverage. But I kept my focus on the 12 jurors who would ultimately decide whether my parents would face consequences for their crimes. When I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, I thought about all the times I had been forced to lie to protect their secrets. And the irony wasn't lost on me that this moment of ultimate honesty would finally set me free. My parents sat at the defense table 30 feet away, flanked by their expensive legal team. And when I looked at them directly for the first time in years, I felt nothing but pity for two people who had chosen cruelty over love so completely that they couldn't even recognize their own daughter's humanity. The scared little girl inside me whispered that they still had power over me, but the woman I had become knew better. Michael Torres guided me through my testimony with the precision of a surgeon, starting with my earliest memories of abuse and building systematically toward the most serious incidents that had nearly cost me my life. As I described the broken bones, the deliberate burns, the nights locked in the basement without food or water, I watched the jury's faces shift from skepticism to horror to determination. The most difficult moment came when Torres asked me to explain the night my father had tried to strangle me, and I had to pause to control my breathing as the memory threatened to overwhelm me completely. But I forced myself to continue, speaking clearly and calmly about how I had felt consciousness slipping away, and how my mother had stood in the doorway watching without making any attempt to intervene. In that moment, I told the jury, I realized that my parents didn't see me as their daughter. They saw me as something they owned, something they could use or destroy as they saw fit. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as I finished describing that night, and I could see that several jurors were crying. When Torres showed the jury photographs of my scars and asked me to explain how each one had been inflicted, I rolled up my sleeves without shame and told the truth that I had been hiding for more than a decade. My voice grew stronger with each answer, and I realized that speaking my truth publicly was the most powerful thing I had ever done in my life. The cross-examination was the moment I had been dreading and preparing for since I first decided to pursue this case, knowing that Marcus Whitfield would try to destroy my credibility using every weapon in his considerable arsenal. He was everything I had expected: smooth, condescending, and skilled at twisting words to support his narrative that I was delusional, vindictive, and financially motivated. He questioned my memory, suggesting that childhood trauma could create false recollections, and that my years of therapy had implanted ideas that weren't based in reality. He brought up my psychiatric records from adolescence, trying to use my treatment for depression and anxiety as evidence that I couldn't be trusted to accurately recall events from my childhood. but I had spent months preparing for these attacks with Dr. Thompson and Michael Torres, and I answered each question with calm precision, never allowing him to rattle me or make me defensive. When he suggested that I was pursuing the case for money or media attention, I looked directly at him and said, "Mr. Whitfield, I gave up a settlement offer that would have made me financially secure for life because this case was never about money. It's about accountability, it's about justice, and it's about ensuring that my parents can never hurt another child the way they hurt Sarah and me." The jury seemed to appreciate my directness, and I could see that his attempts to discredit me were making him look desperate rather than effective. The moment that shattered the defense's strategy came when Torres called Dr. Angela Thompson to the stand to present her forensic analysis of the abuse journals my parents had kept. As she read excerpts from their clinical documentation of my suffering, the courtroom fell into stunned silence that felt like a held breath waiting to be released. The entries she quoted were so detailed and cold that they painted an undeniable picture of systematic torture disguised as parenting. Subject showed increased compliance after 72-hour food restriction combined with isolation therapy, and physical intervention, choking, produced immediate cessation of resistant behavior with minimal lasting physical evidence. Dr. Thompson explained to the jury that this level of documentation was consistent with predatory behavior rather than parental discipline, and that the clinical language used suggested that my parents viewed abuse as a methodology to be refined and perfected. When Whitfield tried to cross-examine her, she calmly demolished every one of his attempts to discredit her findings, explaining that the psychological profiles Sarah and I presented were textbook examples of survivors of systematic childhood abuse. The notebooks were so damning that even my parents' inexpensive defense team couldn't explain them away. And I watched my father's confidence finally crumble as the jury absorbed the reality of what he and my mother had done to me. Several jurors looked at my parents with visible disgust, and I knew that our case had crossed the line from strong to unbeatable. The verdict came after only 4 hours of deliberation, and when the foreman stood to read the jury's decision, the courtroom was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. On the charge of aggravated child abuse in the first degree, we find the defendant Robert Hayes guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit child abuse, we find the defendant Robert Hayes guilty. On the charge of child endangerment, we find the defendant Robert Hayes guilty. The same words were repeated for my mother, each guilty verdict hitting me like a wave of vindication that I had been waiting to feel for 26 years. My father's face went completely white, and my mother began sobbing, not from remorse, but from the devastating realization that their carefully constructed facade had finally collapsed, and the whole world could see them for what they really were. Judge Williams sentenced my father to 15 years in prison, and my mother to 12 years, declaring that their crimes represented a betrayal of the most fundamental duties of parenthood, and that their systematic abuse had inflicted wounds that would last a lifetime. As the judge spoke about the permanent damage they had caused, I felt a peace settling over me that I hadn't experienced since early childhood. Walking out of that courtroom, Sarah and I were no longer their victims, but survivors who had refused to let their cruelty define our futures. The reporters shouted questions as we passed, but I just smiled and kept walking, knowing that I had spoken my truth and justice had finally been served. That night, I called Dr. Thompson and told her something I had never believed I would be able to say. I'm finally free, and I know who I am beyond what they tried to make me. The scared little girl who had learned to hide her pain was finally at peace, and the woman who had fought for justice could begin the next chapter of her life without looking over her shoulder in fear. 2 years later, Sarah and I established the Hayes Foundation for Adult Survivors, helping other victims navigate the legal system and find their voices. My parents' medical licenses were permanently revoked, and their case became a landmark precedent for prosecuting systematic child abuse. Sometimes justice takes decades to arrive, but when it does, it changes everything, not just for the survivors, but for every child who might have been their next victim. Leave a comment below telling us what you thought. We love reading each comment and hearing which part resonated with you the most. Your opinion is super important to us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, click subscribe. And look, the next video is already appearing on your screen with a story that will leave you speechless. Click here, and we'll see you there for another story that will stir your emotions.